used a little bit of a break from all of our deep technical talks and talk a little bit about the history of our profession. And I'll start out talking about what's on my easel over here. And this is, a number of you have asked about it. This is a gift my mother gave me in the early 80s, and it's an artwork referred to as a wooden bas-relief collage. It is Drake's Well. It's the iconic photograph of Drake's Well.
Okay, thank you.
And the artwork was created by an art teacher in my hometown, Jamestown, New York. It's created from wood. There's no pigment or paint on it. It's like 8 different kinds of wood, including some exotic ebony and other things. And he was famous for creating scenes from the western New York, northwestern Pennsylvania area. My mother bought it for me. She thought it looked good in our family room. Many of you know Marty, my wife. She said, "Hey, it'll look great in your office."
Garage.
And so it's been in every office I've had during all those crazy companies I worked for. I only actually changed jobs 3 times. I worked for 12 different companies. And then I had to farm it out to EA. Now, when we worked together at Leyline Energy, I had filled my office with awards from APG and HGS. I couldn't leave pictures, but then I had astronaut pictures, and I gave preference to the astronaut pictures. So we gave this artwork to EA, and you had it for a couple of years, huh?
Tested on Friday.
She claimed she cleaned it, but I'm not sure if that's true or not. I'm sure you did. Okay, we'll start the presentation. It's going to be about 45 minutes. I tried to shorten it. I just couldn't bear taking any of the slides out, so I apologize for that. Drake's Well is the place oil started. It's very famous in the area where I grew up. I grew up about 50 miles from the well, and I grew up south of Fredonia, New York. And those 2 towns will figure in my talk. And you'll see that this is sort of a personal journey in a way, because I didn't realize the history of our own industry for decades until I started getting involved in the Marcellus. And then our 2 buddies in Pittsburgh, Dan Billman and Bill Zagorski, who were very instrumental in the Marcellus play, pulled me back into the history of that area. I do have a bibliography or set of references at the end, which I'll share. And if anybody would like these slides, I'll be glad to send a PDF to you for free, as a matter of fact. And the other point I guess I'd make is you'll see the personal journey in this, and it's really been fun researching it. I pulled together some photographs and some historical documents that I didn't think I'd ever find, but the internet is wonderful. And I have more of a closer association with the history industry than I ever realized. So let's talk about it. The first slide here just... Yeah,
Mine's too fast. I'm going to make sure
yeah,
you
you're too, she's really quick, I know. How did our industry start? I mean, we all love our industry. We've had great careers, but how did it start? If you ever wonder about that question, I really hadn't until maybe 12, 15 years ago. There's the story of rock oil. Rock oil is what the Drake story is about. Colonel Drake was the initiator of the concept of drilling for oil, rock oil, so you could produce it in large quantities. And he was actually, we'll talk about, he was actually funded by an entrepreneurial startup company from Connecticut. We'll also then talk about 2 people you probably never heard of, William Hart, Preston Barmore, and they were the originators of the natural gas industry. And they were really, I keep wanting to think that this one guy, Preston Barmore, was sort of like the Elon Musk of the 1830s. Natural gas story actually starts 34 years before Drake's Well, which I had no clue was true. And the other interesting pattern here is both of them, we can refer to them as the early wildcatters, the first independents. their exploration technique was seeps, surface seeps of oil and surface seeps of natural gas. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, now I got to take you back to my hometown. My hometown is just off the map to the south. This is Chautauqua Lake, New York. It's sometimes considered the westernmost Finger Lake. It's a glacial artifact from the last glacial advance. I grew up in summers in this lake, living down here, water skiing forever on this lake. It's 18 miles long, 3 miles wide. It was very instrumental in me becoming a geologist because I learned there are two moraines crossing the lake, here and here. And the last Wisconsin glacial advance, when it retreated, left those two moraines. This is called Long Point State Park. This is Bemis Point, New York. There's a bridge across it now. First place I ever drank beer is on this slide. If you go, the orientation of this lake is northwest, southeast, and it's going to be a reference point in some of the maps I use later on because it's of geographic significance. If you just go up to the edge of the slide, under the clouds is the Lake Erie shoreline. That is Lake Erie. You go over an escarpment called the Niagara Escarpment, and if you went over here and then traveled 115 miles northeast, you'd be in Niagara Falls, which of course is also an artifact of the last glacial period. Okay? So geographically, where are we? This is Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, Niagara Falls right here. We're going to be talking about Drake's Well, Titusville, Pennsylvania, Fredonia, New York, a small town right on the shore of Lake Erie where natural gas originates, the industry originated. Pittsburgh's down here, and I gave this talk at SIPES. We're actually trying to form a new SIPES chapter in Pittsburgh. There's quite a group of people there who are independent consultants. And that's a story there. Chautauqua Lake is sitting right here, and you can sort of see it. It'll show up better in some other maps. So I have to divert here for 1 second. I got to ask this question. Raise your hand if you were born, raised, or went to college in New York or Pennsylvania. Now, is that not amazing? And Butch, did you raise your hand?
I did.
Yeah, you were close enough. West Virginia County. Well, you went to college in.
I went to college in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and then.
Oh, I forgot that. Oh shoot, you don't even need an exemption then. He's also a Marcellus expert, so that really counts. Okay, where are we going to go in this talk? We're going to talk about the Colonel Drake, the oil first. That's a story a lot of us know something about, and then we'll switch to the natural gas. These two guys, or three guys, changed the world. They really changed the world when you think about it. And this occurred in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s. Okay, let's go to the next one. There is a book. One of the references is The Wildcatters is a book that I found at a bookstore. Very interesting narrative, and that'll be in my bibliography. Okay, so we got to go to Titusville. Titusville is the town where there are abundant oil seeps in a creek that runs through town, affectionately known as Oil Creek. That was a clue. Oil actually seeps to the surface pretty prolifically. The Indians, Native American Iroquois, used it for caulking their canoes. And of course, it's been used as medication historically in other cultures. And the question was, they knew that they could make kerosene from crude oil, get the higher end components out of it, and that could be a fuel. And that's what caused this group of entrepreneurs in Connecticut to say, man, if we could get enough supply of crude, we could refine it into kerosene. They actually used the term distill, which probably comes from the whiskey industry. And that would be a competitive fuel with whale oil. So when you think about it, they formed that company in the 1850s. Natural gas was already being produced, but oil wasn't. And what happens with that story is the whales, we were decimating the whale population in the world to get whale oil. So you remember the stories about Abraham Lincoln. How did he study his law books? A whale oil lamp. Pretty dramatic changes coming. Okay, next one. So Oil Creek, Colonel Drake actually got hired by the company that I've been referring to as called Seneca Oil Company. They named the company after the indigenous people that live in the western New York, northwestern Pennsylvania area. I knew them as Iroquois Indians. They're a subset of the Seneca Nation. Well, they knew the oil was there. Colonel Drake read about it. Seneca Oil hired Colonel Drake to go investigate it. He's not a colonel. He was never in the military. He's a retired railroad conductor. And what he did was go examine the oil seeps, get the local stories about the oil seeps, and he came up with a concept of drilling a hole in the ground. We call that a well, but we didn't have wells back then. And what he did was go to the salt industry, which I believe was in Ohio, because we have the Silurian salt under the Great Lakes area. And he bought a steam-driven cable tool rig. That's what his drilling technology was. So he did the first well. We'll get into that in just a second. In doing this research, I discovered the state park where Drake's Well is located is fairly large. You can go there, they have a museum, you can have a picnic. Well, the story then was Drake decided he'd get aggressive, and he moved his rig to Wildcat Hollow. Scott?
Jeff, great presentation. Really quick question. Where did the Colonel find a cable tool rig, and what purpose did cable tool rigs exist for prior to oil drilling?
I have no clue.
Isn't that interesting that he could go buy a cable tool
And
drilling rig?
I know there is a salt industry active like near Lake Erie.
At the
And they must have been using the rig for,
All right.
you know, they had early technology, so I'm still researching that.
It was for the Marcellus.
So anyway, I believe that is the origin of the term wildcat. And you ever wonder where we got that term? I mean, you know, some colleges have wildcats as mascots, but he moved to Wildcat Hollow, drilled as well, and it was successful. And you can go there now and have a picnic if you want to. You think we should know that, huh? Okay, well, Colonel Drake has not been forgotten. This is a historic marker in Titusville, in the home that he lived in for quite a while. Okay, and then I had to research this a little bit. We actually had a couple articles in the HGS Bulletin, I think written by Jim Coleman from the Amico Research Lab, about the history of the whale industry, how the industry evolved, and the analog of the whale industry for the oil industry, supply, demand, price increases. This is a cartoon I found from Vanity Fair magazine, and I believe it's from the 1750s or 60s. I can't actually read the date very well. This is the whales celebrating that their lives have been saved by the new industry called rock oil. And they're wearing tuxedos and formal dresses. Now, I had the experience of going to Antarctica, and on the way to Antarctica, we did not stop. We went by South Georgia, the islands in the southern Atlantic. And one of the lectures on our cruise ship was about what the whaling industry was like. And man, it was horrible. This is a photo of them rendering blubber from a big old whale into whale oil. Nasty, nasty, and we're decimating the whales. Now, we should get credit in the petroleum industry for saving the whales. Do you think we'll ever get credit?
Not a chance.
Okay, next slide. Let's see what happens here. This is a little bit of more information about what Drake did. This is an artwork and engraving of the rig, and he set the rig up on an island in Oil Creek because he figured that might be the center where the seeps are. And it turns out that was a good idea. But he was actually a skeptic. In fact, this is a quote from, he actually thought the idea was crazy, but he was getting paid to do it, so if you've ever been a consultant, you know how that works. Okay, and then this is the iconic photograph, and so this goes back to 1859. This is the iconic photograph with Drake in the picture, and the enclosed rig. Now, another question I don't have the answer to is, why did he enclose the rig? Don't know the answer.
Cold here.
Rust.
Cold.
Well, if they were drilling in the winter, you'd definitely enclose the rig, yes. But anyway, that is the origin of my artwork and my T-shirt from the 2013 AAPG convention, where AAPG actually created a T-shirt that says, "This is where my profession started in 1859." So it's pretty famous. Okay. Now, a little bit of geology about what happened. As I mentioned, glacial geology is the incredible story around this part of the country. And Colonel Drake set up on the island, and he drilled. If he had gone a little bit farther west, he would have gone into a glacial outwash channel. And he probably never would have gotten deep enough to see the oil because he would have lost circulation in the gravel. He did find oil in this sand, which is referred to as the Drake sand. It's 69 feet below the surface. He didn't go deep enough to find, this would have been one of the major oil pays in the area, deeper, but he couldn't drill that deep at the time. Another interesting thing happened. He developed the concept of drive pipe or surface casing, because he did have circulation problems shallow, and that's how everybody was unable to drill a hole or even a water well, because it's so tough to you lose circulation in the glacial drift. Now, the investors from the Seneca Oil Company actually decided to give up. And they wrote a letter to Colonel Drake and they said, "Sell the rig, liquidate the resources, we're done." The letter didn't get there in time. So he was drilling at 60 feet. They got to 69 feet, 69 and a half feet, they stopped. They went back to the rig the next morning and there was crude oil in the bottom of the well. And that might not have happened. I mean, if that letter had gotten there quicker or they had email, it wouldn't have happened. Okay, I think they sent him $500. That was going to cover all of his employees' payments and so forth. So then this set off what I would call the Black Gold Rush. And if you go to the Drake Museum, there are other museums and historical centers in the area that document what it looked like in this area. And this is an example of how closely everyone decided this is a slam dunk opportunity. And so, what would you think about this spacing? I mean, good God. And it was simply a law of capture for the crew. Okay, I understand the best I can find about Drake's well, it did actually pump at rates up to 20 barrels a day. So he fulfilled his mission of finding a way to get crude oil in quantity. Okay, well, the big issue then became, how do you transport the oil? Because Titusville is not exactly in the middle of cosmopolitan area. So these are a few pictures I got from that. They decided to use used whiskey barrels to transport the oil. And apparently they were fairly abundant, which tells you something else about the culture. And what they did then was transport the barreled oil by horse-drawn, or I assume oxen-drawn wagons, and they had to get it to water. They had to get to a river or a canal close to a river. The actual discovery, Drake's well, was on a creek, Oil Creek. Eventually that flows into the Allegheny River, and that flows into the Ohio. So you could get a transportation sequence of rivers that would allow you to barge oil. Okay, let's try the next one. And another incredible trivia. And this came from an article that was in the APG Explorer, which again is in my references. So quickly after Titusville became the center, they discovered oil nearby, and that was in the town of Franklin, which is south. And Franklin was sort of a cultural center. They actually had an opera house, they had hotels. I don't know why, but they did. And so the opera house would actually have traveling entertainment come to the opera house. And they would hire musicians, actors, so forth. They hired one guy, he was so excited that it looked like a slam dunk. He put his entire life savings into a well. They drilled the well, and it made oil, but it was disappointing. So they tried a new technique, and that was using nitroglycerin in the well, and that ended the production. The well died. So this young man, whose name was John Wilkes Booth, lost his entire life savings. He was very depressed. He was a Confederate sympathizer. He went back to Washington, D.C. and assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. So what if they hadn't fracked that well? You know, American history might have changed there. Okay, well then the next big chapter in the Drake story goes back to Rockefeller. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, was not born he was born in New York, but his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio, which I have great affection for now that I don't live there anymore. And he became an accountant. He was a very meticulous, analytical bookkeeper, basically. Well, he started to observe what was going on nearby, and he decided he'd get into the refining business. So his initial investments were in small refineries, just taking the crude oil and refining it into kerosene. But he was a very shrewd businessman, and so as his company grew, he named it Standard Oil, and he was consolidating the refining business. Okay, let's go to the next one, and he became extremely wealthy very quickly. Now, another little personal note, I found out a few years ago, his original family mansion was in Cleveland, Ohio, on Euclid Avenue, down the street from my fraternity house. And I didn't know it. I mean, I don't know if it's open to the public. So he stayed in Cleveland. That was the origination of Standard Oil. Eventually, he built a headquarters building in New York City. Okay, let me go back. I got to do one more thing on that slide. One thing that attracted attention were his business practices, which we'll get into in a minute. And there was a famous book written by a lady named Ida Tarbell, an investigative journalism, and her father had actually been an owner of a small refinery, and she could see he was being treated badly by the Standard Oil. And so she investigated business practices and wrote a book that was controversial, but explained how Rockefeller was taking advantage of his competitors. My wife went to high school with a Tarbell. How many Tarbells are there? It's got to be the same person. I mean, a descendant of Ida Tarbell. And this actually started, I think we'll see in the next slide, this is one of his early refineries, the antitrust movement. Ida Tarbell's book, and then the other meat industry became the focus of the anti-monopoly effort that Teddy Roosevelt was famous for. So this is how wonderful a refinery looked back then. This is actually one of the early ones that Rockefeller invested in. Okay, and then one more slide on this, and we'll talk about what Rockefeller did. He actually cornered the transportation market. So he had developed all kinds of ways of transporting. Pipeline, railroad, and vehicles were coming into use, horse-drawn mostly. And so he then used his leverage to buy out all the other refineries. He'd negotiate a deal to screw them on their transportation rates give him a discount they'd eventually sell out to him. That was part of his downfall, of course. Okay? So let's talk about the transportation a little more. This is what it looked like on the Allegheny River when they got the barges there to load with the whiskey barrels. And if you've been to the Allegheny River recently, it doesn't look like this anymore. You can actually go fishing. And so this was where the geography comes in. Titusville is here, my Chautauqua Lake is here, and you get into the river system and you get into the Allegheny. The Allegheny goes south to Pittsburgh, where it joins the Monongahela River. And if Andrea Reynolds was here, I had a great one to pull on her, because they join and form the Ohio River in front of the football stadium that she went to all the time when she lived in Pittsburgh, called Three Rivers Stadium. That's the origin of the Ohio River. Okay, so finally, what happened to Old Standard Oil? Now, he got in trouble, first with the state of Ohio, and then the federal government created the Taft-Hartley law, and eventually he got into trouble with the federal government for violating antitrust regulations. And they forced him to break up Standard Oil into subsidiary companies, which he did, and the next slide will show that, something I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This is the timeline from the mid-1800s to 2000 of Standard Oil and how it broke up into all the daughter companies. And of course, today we have Chevron, Exxon, BP, and Marathon. So in a way, we essentially, I think most of us owe our jobs at one point in our career to one of those companies. And so you really should be, Rockefeller should be a hero to us. Anyway, it's amazingly complex. Now, Paul Babcock used to keep our History of Oil Company Name Changes publication from HGS, which got to be such an extensive volume, it was difficult to track it anymore, all this evolution of the change of ownership and the names. Okay. And then Rockefeller, of course, it turns out, was a very religious, devout Baptist as a result of his mother. And he became an entrepreneur. He actually retired at age 56, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest man in the world. Gave money to the University of Chicago. He founded Rockefeller University. He gave away over $500 million. That was back when that was a lot of money, And his descendants now, as many of you know, are environmental activists, and they still have a net worth combined of about $10 billion. And you have to admit, Rockefeller didn't start that legacy on purpose. So. Okay, so that's the story of the oil. And it expanded from there. Once they recognized it could be used as a fuel, internal combustion engines, all the lubrications, everything that came out of it, the industry just exploded, and that's why we're here. Okay, so what about the natural gas? This is more interesting in a way, and it's much earlier. I didn't realize it was so earlier, 34 years before Drake's well. Now, how did that happen? Well, these are a couple of quotes from one of the local newspapers from that time period. And you can see the first attempt ever made to apply natural gas. And this was actually from Fredonia, New York's newspaper. So Fredonia, New York plays a huge role in the birth of the oil and gas industry. I should also say here, one of the primary references for all this material is Dr. Gary Lash. Dr. Gary Lash is a professor at State University of New York at Fredonia, and he's a geology professor, consults a lot to the industry on the Marcellus. But then as he was doing his research on the history of the Marcellus, he got interested in the cultural history, or the actual people history, and he's documented a lot of that. So let's go talk about natural gas. Okay, here is a geographic, or just a cultural map of what's going on. Buffalo's up here, Niagara Falls, Fredonia, my lake, Chautauqua Lake. If you come over here, another interesting we'll start talking about the geology here. This is the end of Chautauqua Lake, and Chautauqua Lake drains to the south, as do all the Finger Lakes. They were stream valleys that had flowed to the north, and the last glacial period stopped those lakes, reversed them, and they started flowing to the south. However, there are a whole set of creeks, and they tell me I'm not pronouncing that right. You know, if you're from New York, you call it a creek. Otherwise, it's a creek or something, I guess. A series of these streams, I'll call them streams, flowing into Lake Erie. The key one goes through Fredonia, New York, and it's called Canada Way Creek. Now, these stream valleys are all incised steeply into the bedrock because of glacial rebound from the end of the last ice age. And so there are tremendous geology exposed in all of those stream valleys. Okay. That also is a drainage pattern change. Everything along the edge of the Great Lakes, Erie and Ontario, flows into the Great Lakes system. If you just get a few miles over the Niagara Escarpment, everything flows south. Okay. Now, the stratigraphy here, which is rarely talked about, near as I can tell, this is a geologic map of the western end of New York State. The Silurian is the outcrop at Niagara Falls. The Lockport Dolomite, that's the resistant unit that keeps crumbling when it gets undermined by the turbulence at Niagara Falls, and the big blocks of Lockport Dolomite fall into Niagara River. And then as you come south, you go through the entire middle and upper Devonian, and it keeps subcropping until you get down to the area that I'm talking about with Chautauqua Lake. A surface geology, this shows you the surface. This is Fredonia, New York. These are all stream valleys, but Chautauqua Lake survived as a body of water, and the other parallel glacial valleys got filled up with sediment, and there's still wetlands there. This is the stratigraphic column. The Marcellus is here. This is all Devonian. There's two shallower, younger black Devonian shales, the Dunkirk, the Rhine Street before you get to the Marcellus. And I'm going to show you, I believe, I have seen the Dunkirk shale in outcrop, and that'll be one of the next photographs. But first of all, we'll talk about Marcellus. So I know some of you have worked Marcellus extensively. Butch has. I've worked it a little bit. Marcellus all started in northwest Pennsylvania and western Pennsylvania, primarily due to range resources. They had the guts to re-enter a well and frack and flow test Marcellus, and it worked. And then we gave Bill Zagorski the APG Explorer of the Year Award in 2013 at this convention. And that set off the Marcellus play. So this is out of date, but this is the extent of the play and some of the early drilling. Drilling is concentrated up here, northwestern Pennsylvania. Cabot was really the instigator of that, then Range Resources. And then various other companies. Then, of course, all the majors came in. Okay, now, I got to go back again. Fredonia's here. The Marcellus actually outcrops along the edge of Lake Erie. It's coming in from the geologic map from the northeast, but you can actually go visit the Marcellus and outcrop on the shore of Lake Erie in the vicinity of Buffalo. Okay? Now, we haven't forgotten about the origin of natural gas. This is a historical marker in the village of Fredonia, and it's commemorating the first use of natural gas. So how did that actually happen? Well, the two entrepreneurs we'll be talking about, Hart and Barmore, their first use of the natural gas was to take it into the town square in Fredonia. Fredonia was founded in 1829. This is their city logo, and the city logo is a 5-burner gas light. I mean, that's their whole story, but I don't think anybody living there knows the story. So anyway, that's a little artifact of history. And again, it's another story about a creek. I could say we're up the creek again. The first observation of this was that there are flammable bubbles in the creek, in Canada Way Creek. And that was actually discovered by the Native Americans, the Iroquois Indians. And the story was you could actually go to the creek with a match or a heat source and light the bubbles, and they kind of pop and explode. And they did that for entertainment, and they showed it to the white settlers. And then an interesting guy named Douglas Houghton, he was the first Michigan state geologist. He apparently visited, and he got all excited about that. So he would entertain people by burning the creek. And the geoscience department, where Gary Lash is a professor at SUNY Fredonia, is named after Houghton. But then the serious person in the origin of it was William Hart. And William Hart is the one who saw the commercial value in the possibility of using the natural gas. Okay? And this, I believe, is from Canada Way Creek. I've been here, but I was not here when they were burning the outcrop. And this was actually a published photo. And of course, this is the incised creek valley with Devonian. And if you find the right fracture at the right time of day, it's not being inundated with creek water, apparently you can actually burn the outcrop. Okay? Now the other famous thing about the Marcellus, and this is where it is outcropping near Buffalo, it's extensively fractured, that's why it becomes a reservoir. I've read where one of its famous features is the orthogonal fracturing makes perfect stepping stones for your garden. So why didn't we discover this, many, many years earlier? Because there's methane in everybody's stepping stones. Okay, and the first commercial use. Now, Hart saw that the gas was there and it was a resource, but how was he going to capture it? He came up with a concept for a technology called gasometer technology. And his first attempt was he borrowed his wife's, one of her wash basins. He was a gunsmith, so he soldered a valve on top of the wash basin. He took it to Canada Way Creek, found a place where there are a lot of bubbles, put it in the stream, and it filled up with gas. Then he could open the valve on top and put the gas, burn it. Eventually he decided to pipe it to the town square in Fredonia. Now, what he did was originally they used hollow wooden logs as the pipe. And where they had to join the pipes, they covered it with tar-soaked cloth. So you can imagine how safe that was. The big advantage was the natural gas doesn't emit an odor. It's much better than whale oil, and I guess it's better than rock oil or kerosene. So he was, of course, he was way ahead of that. So he continued working and eventually switched to pipelines made of lead and tin. Okay? So this is an illustration of how that technology works. And they developed it originally in the creek. Then they started building large, what were they called, cisterns, water-filled cisterns. They would take the gas from a well that they drilled. They'd inject it into the cistern. The gas, of course, would go to the top of the container, and then they could either open a valve at the top or have a tube bring it down out of the side. And so you had water-free natural gas accumulated that you could then use if you could get it to a place where it's usable. Okay. That worked, and he was actually selling gas to the city of Fredonia. They were lighting the town square, and they had a number of businesses that they were illuminating. I guess it was only done at night, and therefore the gasometer would last long enough to allow the use of the gas, and then it would fill up the next day during the day. So, I'm trying to see what I've got in it. This was how it was described in the local newspaper, 1825. The hole was drilled 27 feet into slaty rock. So he started drilling. Now, he didn't even have the technology from the salt industry. They had equipment that was apparently used for water well drilling. And we'll see a picture of that in a minute. But he could get wells down to several tens of feet, and he would then get better flow rates from the wells. Then they had sort of a big epiphany here. They came up with another use for the gas. Fredonia is near a port on Lake Erie called Barcelona. It's the town of Barcelona, New York. They have a lighthouse because it was actually a very important fishing port with commercial fishing boats. He laid the pipeline of hollowed out tree trunks 2 miles to get to this lighthouse, and it was illuminated by natural gas. It's still there, and it's a registered National Historic Site, so it's available to visit. Now, all of this going on in Fredonia became visible in Europe, and so Charles Lyell, one of the founding fathers, Charles and Lund, you've been to visited his grave, okay? He actually made a trip from, I assume, Scotland, it's got to be Scottish, to Fredonia, New York. Now, how the heck did he do that? That's a heck of a trip. And he observed what was going on. He got intrigued by it, and he wrote a report, which is, pretty definitive of what he saw. The streets are lighted. I mean, it was a phenomenon that was completely new to him, and so he documented it to a certain extent. And then we have another entrepreneur who appeared. And this is a guy who is really incredible. First of all, the guy I'm going to talk about is Barmore, but he was influenced by another report written by a geologist named Louis Beck. And he was commissioned by New York State to investigate what was going on geologically. And he wrote a report in 1835 after visiting Fredonia and Canadaway Creek. And here's a couple of quotes from the newspaper. Bubbles of the gas are rising through the water. Gas springs seem to have their origin in a strata of slate. And so apparently Mr. Barmore read this report, and he decided it's a commercial opportunity. And so he was a young man, obviously very entrepreneurial, very skilled. He actually was educated at the Fredonia Academy, which was the forerunner of sunny Fredonia. And he decided to become a Republican politician after making the decision to not go into the family's coffin manufacturing business. That's probably interesting. It wasn't very interesting, I suppose, back then. And so he actually raised money from wealthy local citizens, and he tried drilling more extensively than Hart had, although they knew each other and they were related. And he was able to make wells that were significant producers. This is Hart and Barmore on a rig floor. As near as I can tell, this was a technique to drill water wells, where you actually put your foot in a sort of a stirrup, and you can make this cable tool type connection to go up and down. That must have been a lot of fun, huh? And this is a tintype of Barmore. So Barmore, they were related through marriage. I don't know exactly how they were related, but they were good buddies. Well, Barmore had the wherewithal to actually form a company. And so he formed a company called the Fredonia Gaslight Waterworks, issued stock and bonds, and he did patent his ideas, whereas Drake had failed to patent the surface casing idea. So he then got put together a deal where he bought land on the edge of Canada Way Creek and started drilling holes nearby, and that was working. That increased his supply, and he made a bigger gasometer facility, okay? And this is way ahead of anything else, some of his comments here. He also thought of two things he was interested in, which are published about. The fact that the fractures are apparently real and natural in the formation, but maybe you could actually improve them. Pretty interesting concept. And he was wondering what the actual source was. So he actually looked into the concept of why are the hydrocarbons there. And he actually then attempted to do more fracking because he figured out improving the fracture system could increase deliverability. So Dr. Lash is convinced that Barmore should be given credit as the first petroleum engineer. And I've been trying to pursue that, but I haven't been able to sell it to anybody. Okay. But he did actually frack a well. It's a well, this is the one that's documented, I guess, a little bit better. He had drilled a well at 122 feet. He knew where his objective was, but the well didn't work. So he then lowered a pail of gunpowder down to the zone that he thought was going to be the objective, and they say they dropped it, a red hot poker, into the hole through a tubing. It exploded, and they made a well. So the first frack job was done in the 1830s. Who knew that? I don't think anybody in the energy department knows it. He also experimented with horizontal drilling, which is another story I'm still working on. Okay? So the gasometer technology and everything he did is so far ahead of its time, it's almost incomprehensible. And he did this when he was in his 20s. Okay, let's see here. This is just some of the statistics. He had a facility, gasometer that could collect up to 11,000 cubic feet of natural gas. They built a cistern, which was a large concrete enclosure you could fill with water, pipe the gas into the water, fill up the gasometer, and sell the gas in the evening or in the night. Okay, now, Barmore then had a very sad outcome. He actually died of alcoholism at 30. But he had done a lot of sophisticated financial planning. He left his estate to his two of his relatives, I believe it was his mother and his sister, who then became founders of the Women's Christian Temperance Union because of the horrible outcome of him dying of alcoholism. And imagine what would have happened if he hadn't died at age 30. I mean, what was he going to do next? You know, go to Mars or something? I don't know. So anyway, to finish my story, I uncovered this, and when I was growing up on Chautauqua Lake, we had a summer cottage, and the cottage next door was owned by the Barmores. And they had a business, and it was recapping truck tires. So I have to tell you, if you drive down the highway and you see the casings and treads from 18-wheelers laying all over the place, Mr. Barmore figured out how to make a business out of recapping the tires. And an 18-wheeler is very expensive to buy a new tire, so you recap them. So he created a very successful business. I grew up in summer next door to his youngest son. They were so rich they had a Chris Craft. And we used to go water skiing behind the Chris Craft. I was with them when they bought the Chris Craft. Mr. Barmore brought a check for $5,000. I didn't know you could write a check for $5,000 until I got the last MasterCard bill. But the punchline here is he had two facilities. This one is in Jamestown, New York. The other one is in Fredonia, New York, next to Canada Way Creek. I've been trying to get in touch with my childhood friend for 5 years. I can't find him. I know he moved away, and he's not on Ancestry.com or Facebook. Okay, so here we go. This is the end of the talk, but I have to say this. You remember the movie Gasland that was nominated for an Academy Award and probably led to the banning of fracking in New York State because it puts methane in the drinking water. Bull. And they faked that in the movie. You know, they said, well, this is so horrible, you frack these wells and we have methane in our drinking water and you can light it at the faucet. I grew up drinking methane-laced water, as did the Iroquois Indians. And pretty amazing. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, one slide here. This is from another book. This is from the Wildcatter also. And this book was, this will be on my list of references, but basically the historians would say, well, this activity in Pennsylvania, New York, then quickly migrated throughout the country. It came to Louisiana, it came to Texas, came to the Permian Basin, came to California, and it was the people who were involved early in the industry that knew the technology that then migrated and then eventually took that technology to Europe and so forth. So this is a very interesting book, and of course for them, Spindletop, which we think was the origin of the Texas oil industry, happened, 40, 50 years after Drake's well. Okay, I think that's it. These are the references. Really interesting one in APG Explorer, just recently. There's a great Chernow's biography of the Rockefellers, is extremely interesting. There's an APG publication with field trip guide notes in this area. That's from '89. I didn't know that. And I don't know any of the people who wrote the book either. And then finally, Gary Lash has a publication on discovery in the APG's Discovery Index. And then, of course, Bill Zagorski's article and paper in APG Bulletin, which is definitive Marcellus stratigraphy and the history of the origin of the industry. And this is the other book, Zuckerman, The Frackers, 2014. And he's a journalist, and it's like a book we would have written about how the origin of the technology came. So that's it. That's the story. Hope you found something you can use in trivia contests in the future. And appreciate the chance to tell it. And if you got any questions, I'll try to fake it. So.
Yeah. Any idea what happened to Drake? Did he become wealthy?
No.
He died.
He failed to capitalize on the technology and by not patenting it. And I don't think he died destitute, but you kind of lose the story and nothing distinguished happened to him. And you can go there. I mean, it's very interesting. There's a great museum on the property. And, it's not that far from Pittsburgh. It's like, 40, 50 miles from Pittsburgh, maybe. Maybe hour and a half drive. Worth going to. And I'm just, I've told this story now 3 times to SIPES groups, 2 SIPES groups, and you guys. And it's amazing that we don't know this story any better than we know it. And, I have yet to find anybody who I wasn't telling them something they didn't know about, especially about the natural gas. And where the hell did Wildcat come from? I mean, we call ourselves Wildcatters. It's a whole industry, portion of our industry, but where did the term come from? Okay, well, thank you.